The Mafia boss gave her everything, but every gift was part of a trap shop. New tires, paid rent, designer dresses, rare books, and a chance to become the writer she had once dreamed of being. Lucien made Elena feel seen, protected, and chosen. But when she discovered he had been watching her for months, every beautiful gesture suddenly looked like manipulation, and every kiss felt like a lie. You and I are going to unpack this case file together, examining the exact moment a fractured psyche meets an apex predator. Elena stands shivering in a torrential downpour, completely hollowed out. This is the precise second Lucien Moretti, a syndicate kingpin operating with the calculated precision of a megalomaniac narcissist, locks his dead eyes onto her. The clinical lesson here is simple. Sometimes your environment entirely shatters your reality just to rebuild you in a darker image. Minutes prior, under the sterile, fluorescent hum of a local market, this 26-year-old woman was meticulously counting pennies. She exhibited classic signs of chronic stress, desperate to save $2 on oats, while eviction notices burned a psychological hole in her empty pockets. Observe the severe micro-tremors in her hands. This is not merely a physiological reaction to the freezing draft. It is the profound neurological exhaustion of working consecutive shifts at a diner that pays in loose silver, where her wages cannot even secure basic transport. We are witnessing the systemic degradation of her ego. Remember this vital life lesson. A human mind cannot possibly flourish if the systemic soil holding its roots is laced with toxic insecurity. Elena lacks the cognitive bandwidth to even formulate a dream. But as she rounds the corner by the rotting fruit, her autonomic nervous system misfires. Her heart stalls. Standing 20 feet away is Grayson Vale. He is 6 feet and 2 inches of pure trust fund arrogance, flanked by an heiress draped in heavy diamonds. A sudden wave of psychosomatic nausea hits her violently, nearly dropping her against the scuffed linoleum. She attempts to retreat into the shadows. A textbook avoidance behavior triggered by acute trauma, but clinical reality rarely offers a clean escape. Grayson calls her name, layering his tone with a theatrical, highly manipulative shock. Her amygdala screams at her to initiate flight, yet she suppresses it, forcing an agonizingly fragile smile onto her pale face. Grayson closes the distance with the predatory swagger of a man insulated from consequence. He pulls his new behavioral trophy forward, his empty gaze clinically dissecting Elena's frayed coat and the pathetic safety pin holding it shut. The life lesson here is absolute. Never let a psychological abuser see your open wounds. The casual way he notes she looks exactly the same is a masterclass in covert psychological warfare. We see Elena gripping her plastic basket until her joints turn white, a desperate grounding technique. She murmurs that some things change while others remain static. A sadistic micro-expression crosses Grayson's face as he introduces Victoria Ashford, effortlessly minimizing his 3-year history with Elena into a non-event. Victoria extends a hand, displaying the vacant, socially conditioned smile of the elite. When Elena meets her grip, her blistered, thermally burned skin grates against Victoria's immaculate palm. The degradation is palpable, but retain this life lesson. Those thick calluses simply prove I've structurally have survived in an environment designed to completely break you. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The socially oblivious fiancé prattles endlessly about their upcoming nuptials, lacking the emotional intelligence to read the suffocating tension. Grayson smoothly interrupts to assert his financial dominance, bragging about an elite French caterer they could never afford previously. His predatory focus remains entirely fixed on Elena. You and I know the only healthy response to a malignant narcissist is immediate removal. Yet, he crosses a serious boundary, actually inviting her to their engagement gala. Victoria shifts uncomfortably, but he simply talks over her. The life lesson is bleak but vital. Sadistic individuals will always use your silent, desperate agony as their personal theater. Elena feels her dissociative mask beginning to slip. Right there in that oppressive, sterile corridor, Auditory exclusion takes over as her psychological defenses undergo a catastrophic failure. I mean, processing the gloating of the man who systematically dismantled her ego empties her out entirely. She attempts to deploy a polite refusal, quietly stating her schedule is at capacity. Grayson's smirk mutates into genuine antisocial malice. He interrogates her about her time, openly weaponizing her grueling diner labor against her. Victoria stands paralyzed, slowly recognizing this is a targeted psychological demolition. Grayson leans in, lowering his voice to a coercive register. Document this life lesson carefully. True pathology is always exposed when someone possesses unconditional power over another. He whispers she is just ashamed. Her respiratory rate plummets. Grayson executes a calculated emotional strike, dragging her repressed ambition of becoming a writer out into the harsh, clinical light. He regurgitates his old conditioning, asserting that creative pursuits are an exclusive privilege of the wealthy elite. It is an act of unadulterated emotional violence. We observe her pupils dilate with unshed grief, but her jaw locks as she denies him the biochemical satisfaction of her tears. Dictating the party logistics, he orders her to witness his fabricated triumph, then dismissively rotates away. Note this essential life lesson. You must never allow a deeply fractured mind to dictate the intrinsic value of your own spirit. Severely dissociated, she forces herself through the transaction, stepping out into a freezing November squall. The sub-zero precipitation immediately compromises her inadequate thermal protection. We analyze this scene from an isolated perspective as her fine motor skills fail against the rusted car locks. Her visual cortex is overwhelmed by tears. Then, environmental stress introduces a compounding variable. Her front tire is deflated. Staring at this mechanical failure in the violent weather, her resilience baseline drops to 0. She survived the interpersonal trauma. But this mundane logistical failure is the catalyst that fractures her psyche. She collapses against the metal door, weeping into her freezing hands. This presents a harsh life lesson. Sometimes you must allow a complete psychological collapse so the cognitive pieces can be reconstructed into steel. A dark, calm voice suddenly interrupts. The specimen standing above her is a severe statistical anomaly for this sector. The ambient light frames his imposing physical dimensions, clad in bespoke charcoal fabric that signals a highly organized, predatory dominance. He exhibits the facial symmetry often noted in clinical profiles of organized crime leaders. His dark eyes analyze Elena not with empathy, but like a behavioral puzzle he is suddenly compelled to deconstruct. Hyperventilating, she verbally masks, claiming she is functionally fine. She wipes her face, realizing his empirical observation is correct. She has lacerated her palm on the rusted steel. Absorb this life lesson. Acknowledging your own total systemic ruin is the prerequisite for behavioral recovery. Elena laughs bitterly, forcing her unstable legs upright. Stick with me, because this is where the trauma bonding protocols initiate. Her spatial awareness deteriorates rapidly during a severe syncopal episode. She does not register the blackout until his unyielding hands intercept her fall. The stranger secures her compromised body. His vocal frequency drops, vibrating with a restrained hostility as he interrogates her about her last caloric intake. The aggression is palpable, yet clinically redirected away from her. She attempts a feeble defensive maneuver, but her motor cortex is totally unresponsive. He instantly processes her physical metrics, noting the severe malnutrition and shock. The life lesson here is crucial. Sometimes you must hit absolute physiological failure before you allow an external force to remind you that your survival actually matters. Hovering near a dissociative state, she confesses her last meal was a single piece of toast. We document the extreme mechanical tension in his jaw, a classic indicator of repressed violent ideation. Displaying absolute behavioral dominance, he executes a microscopic wrist gesture. Two imposing enforcers materialize from the shisu, exhibiting the blunt force utility of syndicate operatives. One systematically retrieves her scattered rations. Elena's buried fight-flight-fast mechanism finally registers the severe threat level. She recoils her injured limb, demanding his identity. He bridges the gap, weaponizing the name Lucien Moretti like a heavy neurological anchor, and issues a non-negotiable directive to enter his vehicle. Document this life lesson. Always trust your threat instincts, but never let psychological pride prevent you from accepting a critical lifeline. We begin our clinical observation with a classic display of coercive control. The subject, Elena, is paralyzed on the wet pavement, registering Lucien as an apex predator. This megalomaniac narcissist uses sheer atmospheric gravity to pin his target. He reveals he has been watching her, studying her learned helplessness as her ex-partner systematically degraded her. Then, he offers a calculated ultimatum: remain freezing in the mud, or enter his shadowed world and be elevated to royalty for one night. You and I must unpack this together, because the psychological lesson is vital. You never have to tolerate the cruelty others have programmed you to accept. Logic screams at her nervous system to flee, yet she remains locked in a state of absolute tonic immobility. The phantom sensation of an engagement ring burns Elena's skin, a somatic manifestation of trauma, while freezing rain assaults her. Yet, this dangerously quiet kingpin observes her as though she is the sole living organism in his environment. Come, he whispers. Listen, you and I know the clinical fear of trusting a stranger, but occasionally, a blind cognitive leap is the only mechanism to rewrite a shattered life. She extends her hand, initiating the first stage of Stockholm Syndrome. Lucien exhales as their fingers connect. She registers the jagged scar tissue, mapping his knuckles clear indicators of chronic violence. They seal themselves inside his black sedan, essentially a mobile isolation chamber. Sinking into the leather, her fragile voice trembles. Where are we going? In the dim glow of the cabin, Lucien dispatches rapid communications. He clinically states they are proceeding to his residence for medical triage before she loses consciousness. Clinging to her fractured ego, Elena insists she is uninjured. He ignores the defensive fabrication. The atmospheric pressure in the vehicle shifts, heavy and suffocating. He demands the identity of her abuser, his vocal register dropping into a chilling frequency. She confesses Grayson Vale discarded her for a partner with generational wealth. Remember this psychological truth. True value is never measured by socioeconomic pedigree, and the right individuals catalog your worth instantly. Lucien leans back into the shadows. Better, he murmurs, the syllable dripping with unadulterated, cold disgust. Elena's nervous system misfires as she admits. Grayson invited her to his engagement event strictly to observe her psychological hemorrhaging. Lucien becomes utterly motionless. In his behavioral profile, absolute silence is a catastrophic indicator. He extracts the target's full designation. Grayson Alexander Vale. A violent cognitive switch flips behind his dark irises. He contacts an operative, initiating a forensic background investigation. Every buried transgression on his desk by dawn, Elena panics. Why execute this protocol for a stranger? I am ensuring nobody degrades you again, he states. We observe a universal mechanism here. When an abuser fractures a spirit for sport, retaliatory trauma always returns to collect the debt. The heavy sedan parks outside a monolithic skyscraper. They enter a sphere of untouchable wealth. Silent security personnel bow, projecting an unspoken threat of organized violence. Lucien escorts her into a penthouse resembling a clinical art installation dominated by architectural glass. He directs her onto a sofa, acquires medical supplies, and without hesitation, the billionaire drops to his knees. He sanitizes her lacerations with the detached precision of a seasoned operative. She whispers an observation of his surprising competence. His exhausted gaze locks onto hers. People in my orbit have a tendency to suffer trauma, he murmurs. Let this empirical truth sink in. Real strength is never demonstrated by the hoarding of resources. It is defined by an apex predator, willing to kneel on the floor to mitigate a victim's suffering. When she probes the origins of his capital, Lucien executes a calculated pause. He pours 2 glasses of spirits, Imports, exports, he murmurs. I solve logistical problems. We know exactly what organized brutality masquerades behind that terminology. He positions himself close, demanding unedited disclosure. Elena's psychological dam fails. She verbalizes her buried traumas, detailing how Grayson systematically dismantled her self-efficacy. He gaslit her into believing her literary aspirations were delusional. We can all extract a vital lesson from this pathology. Never permit a parasitic partner to contract your psychological environment or convince you your passions lack worth. She nearly eradicated her own identity for a narcissistic captor. Grayson discarded her when her academic funding collapsed a mathematically calibrated emotional strike. Lucien absorbs this data, his micro-expression suppressed. He deploys a tactical counteroffensive. She will infiltrate that engagement event, and he will function as her escort. Grayson will observe the asset he abandoned and experience acute distress. Why would a syndicate leader invest in her shattered variables? Lucien's thumb maps the tear tracks on her cheek. The moment I analyzed your distress, I recognized a mirrored pathology, he murmurs. And I never relinquish assets in my possession. Remember this behavioral lesson. The most devastating psychological retaliation is manifesting in your abuser's environment as an untouchable, fully optimized entity. Lucien smiles, a predatory facial contraction. The operational game has commenced, he whispers. Elena regains consciousness. Cognitive recall of yesterday's trauma floods her prefrontal cortex, the rain, the mechanical failure, and Lucien's optical lock on her psyche. She scans the urban grid. Her contaminated garments have been eradicated, substituted with silk saturated with his pheromones. Her device vibrates with inquiries from her roommate. Elena transmits a fabricated narrative, incapable of articulating her presence in a cartel fortress. She analyzes the excessive marble architecture of the washroom. Keep this clinical truth documented. Sometimes hitting absolute systemic failure is merely the environmental trigger required to radically upgrade your baseline reality. The facility is a masterclass in brutalist aesthetics. Elena tracks the olfactory signature of caffeine into the culinary sector. Lucien is positioned there, his shirt rolled above chronically scarred extremities. He projects devastating physical dominance. A fiercely territorial shadow maps his micro-expressions. You are awake, he notes. Sit. It is an absolute behavioral command. Elena complies, anchoring to a stool. He presents a nutritional plate she has been economically prohibited from consuming for months. Ingest it, he instructs softly. We will execute dialogue subsequently. She processes a tremulous bite. Remember this diagnostic truth. An entity's authentic psychological power is proven by how they provision you when your transactional utility to them is zero. Every variable in his ecosystem operates with psychopathic precision. Elena eats under his sustained surveillance. He deploys a logistical shockwave. He has mandated the total reconstruction of her vehicle. Elena's respiratory rate spikes, refusing his unilateral resource allocation. I possess the capability, therefore it is executed, he replies. He demands her coordinates to liquidate her financial liabilities. Surrender the data voluntarily, or my network will acquire it. Elena begs him to terminate this psychological manipulation. Lucien invades her personal space. You are experiencing systemic drowning, he murmurs, and I am the external buoyancy. The clinical reality we must accept. Ego defense mechanisms are maladaptive when your vessel is actively submerged. Accept the extraction. Elena's vocal cords tremor. Why allocate resources to an unvetted subject? Lucien breaks visual contact, his narcissistic armor fracturing to expose a historical trauma. He observed his maternal figure expire because her ego prohibited resource solicitation. He recalibrates his focus onto Elena. You operate with that same self-destructive pride. He diagnoses, selecting martyrdom over assistance. I refuse to passively monitor your self-eradication. I am not your maternal figure, Elena whispers, resisting the trauma bonding. Lucien's scarred digits frame her face with paradoxical gentleness. Negative, he concurs. You are an anomalous variable, An entity I never calculated I would isolate. The psychiatric lesson is profound. Impregnable dissociative barriers are frequently dismantled by an unpredicted breach of raw human vulnerability. Instead of a flight response, Elena gravitates toward his damaged hand, finding the first authentic comfort registered in years. Lucien formalizes the blueprint. They will infiltrate Grayson's engagement ceremony to confront his cognitive dissonance. Elena categorizes the strategy as clinical insanity. Lucien manifests a predatory smile. I constructed an empire on modeled risks, he murmurs, and you represent a highly favorable probability. What ensues is a neurologically chaotic week. Elite tailors materialize with bespoke garments. He transmits mandates enforcing her caloric intake. Her transport is delivered, provisioned with obscure literary volumes. We must encode this lesson. Never integrate with a partner who categorizes you as a secondary option. When a dominant force is prepared to clinically worship you as an absolute masterpiece. Let us open this case file and observe the initial stages of a classic trauma bond. Elena sold her first edition novels simply to survive the collapse of her reality. Touching those covers now triggers an acute stress response. By morning, massive floral arrangements overwhelm her workplace, a textbook display of love bombing. When she calls, he employs strategic silence. Then, the subject, Lucien, enters. He wears the uniform of Apex Wealth, his presence a dark, crushing gravity. A manager drops a tray, sensing the predator. Lucien orders black coffee, his smirk perfectly calibrated to assert dominance while mimicking a harmless patron. The clinical takeaway here is vital. When a megalomaniac narcissist targets the exact wounds you thought were hidden, recognize the trap and run. The fluorescent lighting provides a stark environment as Elena vocalizes her distress, stating his presence is suffocating her. Lucien exhibits zero autonomic arousal. He slides a $100 bill across the counter, his tone a flat line of financial superiority. He issues a directive, commanding her to be ready Saturday at 6, specifying a black open-back dress. She exhibits a severe startle response. How does he know her closet? He promises to map every shadow she conceals. He withdraws, leaving a vacuum of control. She lies to her roommate to protect the developing pathology. A simple life lesson emerges from this data. Absolute, terrifying control never needs to raise its voice. It operates in the quietest, most calculated whispers. Jessica paces the apartment, interrogating Elena about the benefactor. Elena surrenders her phone, the blue light illuminating her roommate's shock. Jessica identifies the behavioral risk, asking why Elena would bring a dangerous unknown to the territory of a toxic former partner. Does he know she is destitute? Elena nods, perceiving his intervention as salvation, rather than calculated grooming. Jessica provides a stark, accurate assessment. Predators with systemic power do not offer charity. They meticulously construct absolute debts. Yet, Elena fixates solely on the tactile memory of his thumb on her jawline. The life lesson here is critical. Placing trust in another fractured psyche is a devastating gamble, particularly when their mercy is merely a beautifully disguised cage. In my clinical experience, victims often recall the moment they dissociate from their vulnerability. Elena remembers Lucien, analyzing her like a fragile artifact. Saturday brings a heavy storm, mirroring her internal panic. Her amygdala fires, demanding flight. But the black silk dress acts as psychological armor, exposing her spine but shielding her trauma. The broken patient vanishes from the mirror. A combatant emerges. At exactly 6, his message arrives. Her physiological tremor returns. Jessica observes from the periphery, noting Elena appears capable of reducing a human heart to ash. Elena accepts the assessment. The lesson here is profound. Sometimes, you must adopt the chilling mask of a villain to reclaim the autonomy that was violently stolen from you. Stay with me, because you and I are examining the threshold of no return. Here is a clinical life lesson. The most catastrophic red flags are often concealed beneath bespoke tailoring. Elena rationally knows this megalomaniac narcissist could eradicate her existence, yet the trauma bond pulls her outside. He stands by a black sedan in the fog. His visual sweep assesses her before he verbally validates her appearance. She attempts to maintain psychological boundaries, but his lethal smile dismantles them. He physically guides her, placing a firm hand on her exposed spine, a classic, non-verbal assertion of ownership. Inside the vehicle, he rapidly issues commands in Italian over the phone, saturating the confined space with the crushing reality of his criminal enterprise. His vocal cadence is devoid of empathy. Terminating the call, his predatory focus shifts to her. He asks if she is prepared. Elena vocalizes her intense fear. He responds by gently tracing her hand, a calculated reinforcement tactic. Let us note a critical life lesson. Align yourself with individuals who recognize your resilience, not those who exploit it. Lucian states that her abuser, Grayson, is about to face severe consequences. Grayson utilized diminishing tactics, but Lucian uses elevation to secure his psychological hold. He promises absolute protection. They reach the Rosewood Hotel, a monument of cold marble. With his hand firmly against her skin, they enter the venue, and the ambient noise of the elite room flatlines instantly in their terrifying wake. Auditory distress ripples through the ballroom. Guests murmur the name Lucien Moretti, displaying collective avoidance behavior. Powerful executives exhibit physical panic, hands visibly trembling. Lucien maintains a dominant posture, parting the crowd like an apexed predator. The primary stressor appears. Grayson occupies the bar, displaying the grandiose smirk of a lower-tier narcissist. As his visual field registers Elena, his cognitive framework collapses. His arrogance disintegrates into primal dread upon recognizing the megalomaniac beside her. A profound life lesson. The universe always extracts its devastating toll when you believe you are untouchable. Grayson stumbles, completely unable to process the lethal threat, moving steadily toward him. Grayson exhibits a visible tremor during the handshake. His greeting is fragmented. Lucien mimics a polite social smile, his ocular focus remaining dead. Victoria approaches, displaying artificial histrionics to establish dominance. Lucien responds by deploying a psychological explosive. With a flat, regulated heart rate, he announces their engagement. Elena gasps, but his digits apply pressure to her waist, a somatic command for compliance. Grayson suffers an acute ego injury, stammering about their recent separation. Lucien coldly categorizes Elena as an acquired, superior asset. The clinical life lesson? Never provide your past abusers with the visual feedback of your pain. Elena mirrors Lucien perfectly, donning a serene, impenetrable mask for the stunned crowd. Elena suppresses her panic, offering quiet agreement. Victoria's superficial charm shatters. Seeking leverage, she degrades Elena's socioeconomic status as a barista. Grayson remains in tonic immobility. Lucien intercepts the hostility with surgical precision. He reframes the narrative, stating Elena is now a fully funded author at the center of a publishing war. Internally, Elena is experiencing psychological asphyxiation. The trauma Grayson inflicted had entirely blocked her creative output for months. The tragic life lesson is apparent. Adopting a bold fabrication is sometimes the only imperative left to survive a hostile room. As Grayson struggles to process his diminished reality, Elena fully dissociates into the role, discovering that vengeance triggers a highly potent dopamine rush. Grayson attempts clumsy manipulation, fabricating a history of supporting her ambitions. This triggers a shift in Elena. Her grief calcifies into hostility. She weaponizes his past verbal abuse, stating he once classified her writing as a delusion. The guests fall silent. Grayson backtracks, citing a need for realism. Lucien's vocal register drops to a predatory frequency, diagnosing Grayson as psychologically stunted. A vital life lesson. Never allow an insecure entity to convince you your potential is a burden. A photographer interrupts the standoff. When the lens focuses on Elena, her flight response peaks. Lucien acts as a physical barrier, adjusting her posture and performing the role of the devoted captor flawlessly. Lucien issues a behavioral command, instructing her to simulate joy. Elena executes an agonizing smile as the strobe fires, Grayson exhibits the physiology of a man viewing his own execution. As the gala progresses, Elena enters a dissociative state. Lucian maintains continuous physical contact, broadcasting a territorial signal to the room. Record this life lesson. True psychological armor must be manufactured internally, even while your nervous system collapses. Eventually, Elena seeks refuge in the isolated restroom. But pathological environments offer no sanctuary. Victoria breaches the perimeter. Stripped of her social facade, she applies cosmetics like a combatant. She characterizes Elena as a disposable narcissistic supply. Elena grips the porcelain, bracing for the psychological hemorrhage. Let us evaluate this space together. You and I can detect the drop in ambient temperature, a hallmark of confrontation. Elena anchors her stance, masking her terror with defiance. Victoria unleashes verbal venom, demanding how a destitute subject secured the most lethal predator on the seaboard. Elena naively suggests he values her mind. Victoria rejects this with a dysregulated laugh. She delivers a devastatingly accurate profile. Megalomaniacs like Lucian lack the neural pathways for empathy. They do not bond. They hoard traumatized subjects as artifacts. She labels Elena a transient fixation. A neutral bystander enters, detects the threat, and withdraws. Here is your operational life lesson. Clinically miserable entities will always attempt to pull you into the freezing vacuum of their own despair. Let us open this file and observe the subject, Elena. Notice the involuntary tremors as she grips the cold marble sink. She attempts to suppress acute panic while Victoria delivers a razor-thin smile, leaving her in silence. Across the ballroom stands the megalomaniac narcissist, Lucien. Engaged in negotiations, his hypervigilance detects Elena's fractured reflection, and his environment ceases to exist. He crosses the floor, demanding the truth. The clinical lesson is absolute.
Utter futility.
A predator who has made a forensic study of your breathing. As her defenses crumble and cruel words spill out, his heavy hand anchors her trembling chin. He forces her to meet his dark stare, snapping her from her dissociative state. Look closely with me, because the power dynamic here is violently shifting. Lucien stares into her eyes, dissecting Victoria's hollow existence, and confesses a raw psychological truth. Finding Elena weeping in that desolate lot fundamentally rewired his neural pathways. Now, his obsessive focus is to eradicate any source of her distress. "You are mine," he whispers, a declaration carrying the pull of absolute ownership. Before she can process this dark possessiveness, chaos erupts. Heavy doors are thrown open as federal agents flood the venue, freezing the glittering crowd in sheer terror. We find a profound life lesson. Embedded in this trauma, never fail to cherish the rare individual who stops to honor your emotional collapse. Even as society marches blindly forward, the agent's voice fractures the silence, demanding Grayson. Observe how the arrogance drains from his face, replaced by the dread of sudden exposure. He stammers excuses while officers secure steel cuffs around his wrists for financial fraud. The room shatters. Victoria wails hysterically while Grayson's father shakes with fury. Elena remains paralyzed in shock, anchored only when Lucien leans into her ear. "I told you," he murmurs, his tone exhibiting psychopathic smoothness. "No one hurts you," and walks away. Her blood runs cold as she processes his dark smirk. The terrifying cognitive realization clicks into place. He orchestrated this entire downfall. The life lesson is clear: karma inevitably collects its debts, especially when a relentless predator guarantees the delivery. Elena hyperventilates, staring at her abuser's ruin. She asks how he managed such a surgical takedown. Lucien stands tall, chaotic police lights washing over his face. He explains he used his criminal network to expose Grayson's sins, forcing a federal collapse. "You destroyed his life?" she asks, trembling. His clinical reasoning is a terrifying blend of obsessive attachment and pure ruin. He confirms it was solely because Grayson dared to make her cry. Disrespecting her required absolute annihilation, a classic megalomaniacal response. She calls him insane, and he smirks, agreeing he is exactly her brand of pathological madness. The life lesson is stark. If someone is willing to burn the world down to keep you warm, you must be certain you can survive standing in their flames. Amid the panic, Lucien stands as Elena's sole psychological anchor. Trembling, she whispers a desperate plea for space. He loosens his grip, delivering a quiet ultimatum. She may walk away tonight, but she has exactly 3 days before he claims her. Her rational brain screams to run, but we see early signs of Stockholm Syndrome as her exhausted body leans into his warmth. Questioning the timeline, his composed facade fractures. 3 days is the limit his sanity can endure without her. He brushes a curl from her face, moved that she perceives humanity beneath his pathology. She weeps, overwhelmed by his dark devotion. Remember this life lesson: sometimes the figures society paints as absolute nightmares are the only protectors, fierce enough to guard your fragile peace. You and I must pause here to analyze this behavioral wreckage. Elena points out the madness of annihilating a man's life in front of 500 elites. Lucien harbors zero sociopathic regret. He pulls her flush against his chest, using his resting heart rate to biologically regulate her panic. He admits his empire was forged in criminal violence, but her presence triggers an uncharacteristic craving for redemption. Outside, sirens wail as camera flashes burst like a storm. As she surrenders to his 3-day ultimatum, he claims her lips in a devastating kiss designed to shatter her cognitive defenses. Here is a life lesson. To carry with you, we often spend our lives sprinting away from trauma, only to collide with the exact storm our damaged soul secretly craved all along. The clinical question is whether Elena possesses the psychological fortitude to survive this ruthless affection. Instead of retreating to a safe baseline, she sits paralyzed in his sedan. Her reality is fracturing. She just watched her abuser dragged away in chains, experiencing staggering emotional whiplash. 7 days ago, she wept over a blown tire in a desolate lot. Now, she steps into a shadow-drenched penthouse, alongside a mastermind of organized crime. He silently pours 2 glasses of dark whiskey, and she swallows hers to self-medicate her nervous system. This paints a profound life lesson. A seemingly minor inconvenience, like a breakdown on a quiet street, can act as the fierce catalyst that violently reshapes your entire psychological destiny. The rush of cortisol and adrenaline fades, letting the crushing weight of the evening collapse upon her. Elena shatters the quiet air, her voice vibrating with panic, as she sarcastically praises him for orchestrating felonies on her behalf. She slams her crystal glass against the wood, furious that he dared to play God with her autonomy. Yet Lucien stands completely unbothered, his sociopathic baseline unwavering. He traps her gaze, declaring a hard psychiatric truth: if given the choice, she would have swallowed her misery to protect a lesser monster from ruin. He traces her jaw, diagnosing her extreme selflessness as a fatal flaw. The crucial life lesson from this tension is clear. You must stop setting your own soul on fire, simply to provide warmth for those who continually freeze you out. Today, you and I are going to unpack the twisted justice unfolding here. Grayson was stealing millions, making his downfall inevitable. Yet, Lucien accelerated a systemic collapse. For one terrifying reason, Grayson caused a tear to fall from Elena's eye. He dismantled an empire purely because its king humiliated his fixation. There is a powerful life lesson in this pathological madness. Never allow another human being to shrink your spirit, for your inherent value is beyond measure. Suffocating under this dark devotion, Elena demands to leave, but Lucien's cold demeanor melts into genuine concern. She is shivering from a parasympathetic crash, and her apartment offers zero security. He offers his guest room, and her exhausted mind lacks the strength to wage another war. Observe as Lucien guides her to the guest suite. He offers a heavy dress shirt before retreating into the shadows, offering only firm boundaries. Left alone in the clinical silence, insomnia grips her. She stares into the dark, caught in a vicious identity fracture. How did she become a woman, draped in silk, standing beside a megalomaniac, as her abuser was dragged away in chains? The paralyzing revelation is the dark dopamine hit she experienced witnessing his ruin. She secretly craved that retribution. This brings us to an essential life lesson. We must often stare directly into the terrifying depths of our own shadow self to uncover our truest desires. As pale dawn breaks, she wanders out, finding her captor armored in a sharp suit, commanding the morning over bitter espresso. Lucien lifts his gaze, tracking her entrance with predatory precision. She stands psychologically exposed, swallowed by his shirt and stripped of makeup. His expression hardens into a possessive look that sends a measurable spike through her pulse rate. He slides a steaming mug across the marble, the silence wrapping around them like a tripwire. Breaking beneath the pressure, Elena demands the brutal truth. Why obsess over a civilian when he could secure any socialite? Lucien anchors her with his hyperfocus. He explains that the elite look at his empire and see wealth, but she looked at his power and was unimpressed. I was terrified, she whispers. The life lesson here is crucial in a world drowning in calculated facades. Unfiltered authenticity is the rarest treasure you can possess. You and I are going to unpack this together, because the psychological shift here is heavy. Lucien refuses to sugarcoat the antisocial poison in his veins. Leaning closer, he confesses a chilling reality. Her fear response is justified. He admits his empire was built on shattered bones, confirming his status as an apex predator. Moving with calculated grace, he closes the distance, threading his fingers through her hair. He whispers that her uncorrupted soul triggers a suppressed ache for moral redemption. He draws her into a slow, devastating kiss. Her survival instincts scream to flee, but Stockholm Syndrome takes over as she surrenders. This leaves us with a profound life lesson. Sometimes taking a reckless leap into the unknown is the only way to finally wake up from severe emotional paralysis. Let us open this clinical file together. The air in the room is suffocating, broken only by Elena desperately pulling air into her lungs. The subject, Lucien, leans in. He gives her exactly 3 days to accept the apex predator hiding beneath his tailored suit. The following days dissolve into a dissociative fugue. His gentle texts arrive with calculated precision, clashing with his violent reality. Soon, her office descends into chaos as images of her ex in handcuffs dominate the monitors. Then, Jessica marches in, her laptop glowing with evidence. We all have a tendency to paint over the red flags when a fantasy offers the illusion of safety. But reality always collects its due. Jessica spins the screen, and the cognitive distortion shatters. Lucien is a dangerous man. The harsh monitor washes over Elena like an examination lamp. Jessica points at the screen, hands trembling with an adrenal response. The digital graveyard maps out, laundered millions and rivals who cease to exist. In the photos, Lucien stands beside corrupt politicians like an architect of ruin. Jessica screams that Elena invited a pathological crime lord into her life. Is she a partner, a project, or merely his next victim? Alice shrinks back in classic denial, whispering that he would never hurt her. When pressed for evidence, her silence is absolute. It is a terrifying truth, but the best people in our lives are those brave enough to drag us out of our blind spots. Elena stares at the floor, feeling the fatal gravity pulling her toward a narcissist. Jessica paces the room, her voice fracturing under the panic. She warns that malignant predators do not fall in love. They collect fragile things, drain their warmth, and leave ash behind. She begs Elena to wake up, terrified of identifying her body when the novelty fades. By Wednesday morning, a sleek package sits on the doorstep. Elena opens it with trembling fingers to reveal a bound manuscript. It contains the exact stories her former abuser forced her to delete. Grayson mocked her dreams, but Lucien bypassed all boundaries to resurrect them. The lesson here is profound. The right person will fiercely guard your fading spark rather than trying to extinguish it. A crisp note rests on top, a silent and heavy promise from a dangerous mind. Stick with me as we analyze this behavioral shift. Elena sits on the floor, pages scattered around her as she consumes the worlds she once built. The reality of her trauma hits like a physical blow. Grayson had systematically dismantled her spirit, burying her passion under his demands. He crushed her dreams, and she allowed the subjugation. But holding this proof of her talent, a hot, therapeutic rage ignites in her chest. She dials Lucian. When she demands to know how he excavated her past, his deep voice hums with dark amusement. He replies that he employs thorough people. She calls it a violation. He answers with a low laugh. Never let a bitter soul convince you of your own mediocrity. Your true potential is always waiting in the shadows to be pulled back into the light. Tears stream down her face, furious that she forgot her own psychological worth. The bitter irony is suffocating. It took a ruthless megalomaniac to rebuild her self-esteem. Lucian's dark laugh vibrates through the receiver. He praises her anger as a weapon. Elena trembles as she asks what happens if she succumbs entirely to his world, a classic precursor to Stockholm Syndrome. His answer is pure, cold authority. She will take his penthouse, quit her job, and write while he burns the world to keep her safe. She labels it a cold transaction. His response drops like thunder. Every human connection is a trade. It only matters what you are willing to spend. Sometimes, to truly live, you'd have to strike a match and watch your old life burn completely to the ground. Elena grips the steering wheel, making a highly irrational move. She rejects the isolated penthouse and demands access to his true sanctuary. Her car drives deep into the night, arriving at a towering stone estate that oozes old-world dread. Armed guards wave her through the iron gates without a blink. Lucian waits on the massive stone steps. His relaxed posture only highlights his predatory grace. For a second, her courage crumbles under his clinical, piercing stare. He offers a slow smile, whispering that he never thought she would willingly walk into the dark to find him. It is easy to judge her from a safe psychological distance, but remember this simple truth. Stepping out of the familiar cages we build is often the only way to find out who we are truly meant to be. Lucian tests her endurance, waiting for her nerve to shatter, but Elena holds her ground. A sharp smirk crosses his face as he guides her inside. The estate is a monument to criminal violence, but the inner rooms reveal a tragic vulnerability. We see worn leather armchairs, scattered novels, and framed photos of a life long dead. He leads her into the absolute isolation of his study. Then comes the auditory trigger. The heavy deadbolt slides into place with a sickening click. Elena's pulse hammers at her throat. He locks his eyes onto hers, stating that the secrets in this room never leave it. He opens a hidden safe and hands her a heavy folder. We often beg the universe for the brutal truth, only to realize our fragile human minds are entirely unprepared for the crushing weight of it. You and I have seen these obsessive patterns before, but the ground is about to give way. Elena opens the folder, revealing a nightmare on paper. It is a terrifyingly precise surveillance record of her life. Bank statements, receipts, and glossy photos of her drinking coffee 6 months ago. Long before they met, this megalomaniac was hunting her. The reason is a severe punch to the gut. Her ex was stealing syndicate money, and Lucian thought Elena held the ledger. The psychological lesson echoing here is vicious. The savior offering to hand you the world is often the exact architect of your destruction. Elena's chest heaves as the reality sets in. Every lingering touch, every soft word in the dark, it was all a clinical, calculated trap to destroy the man who hurt her. Elena stumbles backward, shrinking away as if the air is toxic. She screams, hurling the heavy papers across the floor. Months of her stolen life scatter like dead leaves. The sickening cognitive puzzle finally clicks. The financial rescue, the return of her career, it was all a narcissistic web, spun to manufacture absolute reliance on him. Bitter tears of shame streak her face. She actually believed fate had given her a miracle. But then, Lucian's sociopathic mask breaks. His shoulders drop. In a voice like crushed gravel, he swears that while it started as a strategic mission, the second he truly saw her, the plan burned away. The real tragedy here, the most devastating lies are always the ones we tell ourselves. And the puppet master tripped over his own psychological strings. How does a human psyche survive a blow this heavy? Elena collapses against the wall, weeping openly. She accuses him of staging a manipulative play. mocking the broken girl who fell into his trap. But Lucian's voice cuts through her panic. He closes the distance. His eyes swirl with a pathological sincerity. He swears he never took pleasure in her pain. Then he delivers the confession that changes the entire clinical picture. Tracking her started as syndicate business, but it morphed into a desperate obsession. He studied her fractured soul, because his ruined mind could not grasp how a woman beaten down still carried such hope. There is a deep truth we must remember. Genuine kindness has a massive gravity. Her gentle light was strong enough to shatter a warlord's psychological defenses. The last defensive wall crumbles, leaving the mob boss exposed. He admits to pulling the psychological strings of her life, even destroying her ex. Then, the kingpin drops his guard. With a voice bleeding emotion, he tells her he loves her. He knows his methods were clinically insane. He knows he burned her trust to the ground. But he swears to spend his life rebuilding it. Every survival instinct in Elena's body screams at her to run. But a mind under the influence of Stockholm Syndrome is a chaotic thing. She wipes her eyes, stands her ground, and demands to see the rest of the files in his safe. The hardest lesson of betrayal is this. Sometimes, we willingly drink the rest of the poison just to understand the cure. Lucian's jaw tightens, but he slowly hands them over. Let us look at these pages together, because what Elena finds in that safe is pure terror. She flips through the heavy stack, her fingers trembling. The documents reveal detailed interrogation transcripts, not of her, but of every person she has ever known, her former boss, her old roommate, even the estranged mother she has not spoken to in 5 years. But the most devastating document sits at the bottom. It is a clinical psychological profile of Elena herself. It expertly maps out her deepest traumas and abandonment issues, explaining exactly how a megalomaniac playing the hero could manipulate her. The truth hits hard. Our deepest, most unhealed wounds are the exact places where the wrong people will attach their invisible strings. Her tragic, cognitive realization is finally complete. Let us open this case file together, for you and I are witnessing the psychological collapse of a constructed reality. Elena stares at the playbook in her trembling hands. It is clinical proof that the man she loved viewed her mind as a tactical battlefield. Every gift was a calculated strike against her deepest insecurities. Her scream echoes off the cold marble. Lucian stands rigid, a terrifying portrait of a megalomaniac narcissist defending his methods. He claims his deceit became genuine affection, that he nurtured her dreams. But the clinical lesson here is unavoidable. Psychological manipulation always poisons the well of trust. And no matter how sweet the surface water seems, the roots below are rotting. Her voice shatters under the weight of an impossible psychiatric dilemma. How can any baseline of trust exist with a man who so thoroughly mastered the art of psychological warfare? A suffocating silence descends. Lucian, the hardened architect of his own misery, looks decimated. He swears he would reduce the world to ash, just to protect her, declaring this obsession as his truth. Elena simply offers a hollow, dry laugh. This powerful syndicate boss is now begging his own victim for grace. She turns her back on this agonizing behavioral theater, walking toward the oak door without looking back. It brings us to a harsh but necessary lesson. A toxic attachment, no matter how fiercely it burns, will always leave you standing completely alone in a pile of cold ashes. Lucian shatters the silence with a revelation that halts her momentum. He promises to let her walk away, but unveils the terrifying reality of her former partner. Grayson was not merely swindling investors. He was siphoning millions from the ruthless Calabrese syndicate. Elena freezes, demanding to know how this involves her. Lucian explains the grim mathematics of the criminal underworld. The mob assumes she holds the cognitive map to the stolen money. They will hunt her down and erase her existence. This dark realization serves as a profound behavioral lesson. The company you keep always leaves a permanent mark on your future trajectory. What appeared to be the obsessive shadow of a stalker was actually a deeply twisted attempt to shield her from the real monsters. We arrive at a clinical crossroads where the tension is suffocating. Lucien states plainly that walking out terminates his protection. He cannot save a subject who refuses salvation. Elena vibrates with helpless rage as the illusion of free will dissolves. She must remain captive to a master manipulator or become prey for a cartel. Note the absolute defeat in her posture. Lucien does not sugarcoat his own pathology. He admits he is a terrible sanctuary, yet he is the only barrier between her and the grave. She calls him a monster. Though her rational mind recognizes the bleak truth, she cannot fight this war alone. It is a grim lesson to swallow. Sometimes, securing your survival means staring into the abyss and making a calculated pact with the devil you already know. Observe the brilliant psychological shift that happens here. Elena realizes she is not an equal partner in his eyes, but a behavioral project he wishes to mold. Refusing the role of a passive victim, she looks this dangerous underworld sovereign dead in the eye. She declares her absolute hatred for him, brutally stripping away any delusion of romance. Then, she dictates the ironclad terms of her survival. She demands private quarters, full transparency into his empire, and total isolation. Lucien clenches his jaw, the friction of lost control evident in his facial expressions. Yet he ultimately bows to her terms. This serves as a vital lesson. When your back is against a cold wall, establishing strict psychological boundaries becomes your best armor against complete destruction. Elena continues the clinical dismantling of his ego. She warns that if he ever attempts to pull her strings again, she will tear his empire down. Then comes the fatal strike. She forbids him from ever speaking of love. Those syllables are hollow, coming from a man who treated her trauma like a solvable puzzle. She walks away, realizing she has traded a nightmare for a gilded prison. Left alone, the stoic Dawn finally fractures, shattering a heavy glass against the wall in a fierce display of impotent rage. Elena retreats to the furthest bedroom, locking the door before letting the bitter tears fall. This brings us to an essential lesson. Never let sweet words blind you to toxic actions, because true love will never require a tactical playbook to win your trusting heart. Understand this clinical reality. Elena is not weeping for a worthless former partner. She is mourning the psychological illusion that this underworld figure actually saw the poetry in her soul. For 3 agonizing days, she isolates herself in a darkened room, offering only cold silence whenever Lucien approaches. She desperately wishes to erase his shadow from her mind. Yet, on the 4th morning, a behavioral shift occurs. She steps out into the cavernous mansion. The Dawn honors his word, watching from the periphery like a ruined king. She drifts into a sprawling library to seek emotional regulation. The lesson here is profound. No matter how deeply your trust has been shattered, you must open the door and step out of the darkness to reclaim your footing. Picture this scene with me as we analyze her coping mechanisms. Elena seeks refuge among the vintage books, tracing their covers to ground her anxious mind. The silence is broken by measured footsteps. An elegant Italian matriarch materializes in the doorway, her dark eyes radiating authority. Elena stiffens, stammering an apology, but the older woman glides forward. Introducing herself as Bianca, Lucien's aunt, she drops a psychological bombshell. She notes Elena must be the rare woman who has her ruthless nephew smashing artifacts like an emotionally dysregulated teenager. The lesson here is undeniable. No matter how dangerous someone appears on surface, encountering real affection will always dismantle their heavy defenses and reduce them to a chaotic mess. Elena argues, her voice tight, that Lucien merely executed a calculated manipulation strategy. Aunt Bianca counters with clinical precision. A syndicate boss does not lose sleep over ordinary targets. He does not shatter glass in blind frustration, and he certainly never hands over the encryption keys to his empire. Elena recoils, deeply shaken by this behavioral data. He actually sent the files? Bianca instructs her to check her messages, her tone turning grave. She admits Lucien built his violent kingdom on terror. Yet, he has never truly loved, and that raw emotional exposure terrifies him. The lesson here is profound. when a highly guarded individual hands you the absolute power to ruin them. A terrifying surrender speaks far louder than the dark shadows of their past. Bianca refuses to soften the clinical reality. Lucian was conditioned in an environment where empathy is a fatal error. When he experienced genuine affection, his psychological defenses panicked. He's treated romance like a militant operation to maintain control. Elena counters that obsessive surveillance is not love. Bianca nods, illuminating the tragic truth of his pathology. It is the only distorted dialect of affection a fractured man comprehends. When Elena confesses her inability to trust him, Bianca delivers a foundational lesson. Authentic trust is never conjured by magic. It is constructed, brick by brutal brick, through honest choices. Then comes a chilling crescendo. A rival syndicate is hunting Elena, and her survival rests entirely on Lucian, acting as a human shield in their path. Bianca notes, Elena is the only force strong enough to challenge the dawn. Later, Elena opens her laptop. Look at this moment with me, because the psychological weight is staggering. Lucian actually followed through. He transmitted the blueprints of his criminal enterprise, including all access codes. He effectively placed a loaded weapon in her hands and pointed it at his own chest. His message contained a single, haunting sentence. You demanded my power. Here it is. Do what you will. She stares at the screen, paralyzed by this ultimate display of vulnerability. The profound lesson strikes with heavy force. True power is never about maintaining dominance over someone. It is possessing the courage to hand over your fatal weaknesses, trusting they will never pull the trigger. Elena sits in silence, her fingers hovering over the keys, dictating the fate of Lucian's empire. A single tip, and his legacy burns. Yet without him, she loses her shield. We are witnessing the genesis of a textbook Stockholm Syndrome dynamic. Driven by survival instinct, she forcefully slams the laptop shut. Against all logic, she remains tethered to the monster, shielding her from the storm. She marches down the corridor, pushing open his study door. The ruthless boss looks entirely broken, drowning in ledgers and running on fumes. The lesson we must confront is that attachment does not mean ignoring toxic wreckage. It means demanding cognitive evolution. She leans against the wood, staring into his exhausted eyes. I could destroy you right now, she whispers into the quiet room. Elena reminds him that one phone call could reduce his empire to ash. Lucian simply nods, shadows catching his face. He explains that handing her a weapon was his only method of demonstrating trust in a world built on profound paranoia. She calls him insane, a natural reaction to a megalomaniac's grandiosity. A ghost of a smirk softens his jaw as he asks if she intends to pull the trigger. Her breathing turns shallow. She asks the question tearing her psyche apart. When did she become more than just a pawn? His voice splinters, confessing it was the parking lot, watching her bleed when she expected cruelty. You and I must understand a profound truth here. The moment you stop viewing others as collateral damage and witness their silent agony, the foundation of your reality forever shifts. He confesses that watching her brace for violence broke something inside his chest. Clinically, she carried the silent suffering his mother once endured. If he had let her vanish, her fractured expression would have haunted his every breath. Elena stands paralyzed. Lucian drops his armor, revealing his initial approach was pure sociopathic calculation, but witnessing her rare smile ignited a dangerous obsession. This is no longer a ruthless kingpin, but a desperate man losing his grip on reality. Elena trembles, begging to know if this is another psychological trap. He steps closer, whispering the terrifying reality that she cannot know for sure. The lesson found in this darkness is undeniably brutal. Trust is never a safe equation. It is always a blind, agonizing leap into the unknown. The dim light reveals the despair in his eyes as he begs her to gamble on a man who spent decades mastering betrayal. He swears his sole ambition is her survival. Stepping closer, he lays down his ultimate psychological wager. If she stays, his empire serves as her shield. If she leaves, he promises a new identity and total freedom. Elena asks why an apex predator would offer such radical selflessness. Lucian gently cups her face. The answer defies his narcissistic profile. He loves her. Here is a profound lesson to extract from this shift. Genuine love is never about trapping someone within your personal shadows. It is about handing them the keys to the cage and praying they choose to stay. Looking into his exhausted eyes, Elena recognizes the absolute truth. In clinical terms, this is a pivotal moment of adaptation. Perhaps exhaustion has claimed her, or she is simply too enmeshed to care. Elena is finished running from her own dark obsession. Her posture shifts. If she remains, the old power dynamics must die. No more secrets, no treating her as a disposable pawn. Then she demands the unthinkable. He must teach her the brutal art of violence to survive his world. Lucian agrees to every term, his dark eyes flashing with admiration, as he watches her absorb his predatory nature. She surrenders, warning him trust is still absent. Stick with me here, because this lesson is vital. Sometimes, the only way to survive an inferno is to step deliberately into the flames and claim ownership of the fire. She tells him to simply prove her right. The suffocating tension finally shatters. He pulls her into a desperate kiss, and in a textbook display of trauma bonding, she kisses him back. For 2 surreal weeks, we observe their intimate rhythm. This apex predator spends hours at the firing range, teaching her to aim a weapon. At night, in the amber glow of the library, they exchange quiet tales of childhood trauma. She writes her tragic manuscript about falling for a monster, and Lucian absorbs every word without judgment. It plays out like a beautiful dream, masking the underlying pathology. Consider this an essential lesson to remember. When the storm pauses and the silence feels too flawless, that is precisely when you must check your blind spots. Tragedy is always waiting patiently in the dark. Tuesday morning arrives, and their psychological illusion of safety violently shatters. Elena is in the library when Lucian kicks the doors open, his face drained of color. The rival syndicate has tracked them down. She drops her pages as pure biological panic seizes her lungs. Before they can reach the grand foyer, the windows explode inward, sending a storm of jagged glass across the marble. Lucian throws his frame over hers, shielding her body as merciless gunfire shreds the walls above them. His security team floods the space, returning fire in a deafening symphony of destruction. Let this terrifying sequence serve as a grounding lesson. Your comfort zone is never a permanent fortress. You must always remain prepared to adapt the very second your reality shatters. Elena lies paralyzed, hands clamped over her ears. The scent of gunpowder triggers an acute stress response. Lucian drags her to the kitchen, shoving a cabinet against the door, screaming about an escape tunnel. A blast turns the barricade into shrapnel as 3 assassins pour inside. Instantly, the composed narcissist transforms into the primal monster his profile always suggested. He drops the first man with crushing force, ignores a bullet tearing through his own shoulder, and dismantles the second attacker with his bare hands. It is a horrifying clinical spectacle of raw violence. Here is a solid truth to remember. Extreme pressure strips away our polite masks, and when survival is on the line, you instantly discover who is willing to bleed for you. The third mercenary lunges for Elena, triggering her newly acquired muscle memory. She elbows his ribs and twists free, yet the physical disparity is too vast. A brutal strike to her temple sends her crashing down. Through a dissociative haze, she watches Lucian lose all cognitive restraint, charging with murder in his eyes. But a fourth operator steps from the shadows, pressing a weapon against Lucian's skull. The attacker hauls Elena up by her throat as the rival boss steps into the light. This entire war is built on a psychological delusion. They falsely believe Elena knows where her ex buried a fortune in stolen cash. The lesson here is harsh but unavoidable. You can train for every opponent you see, but the fatal blow always comes from the quiet threat, hiding in your blind spot. The rival kingpin flashes a cold smirk, scheduling her execution once they locate the funds. With a weapon to his skull, Lucian roars she is innocent. The opposing boss laughs, demonstrating classic psychopathic detachment. As hands drag Elena away, she locks eyes with Lucian. For the first time, the untouchable megalomaniac looks entirely shattered. His grandiosity vanishes completely. He screams her name, begging her to remember his love. A heavy blow drops her into unconsciousness. She wakes up bound to a rusted chair inside a decaying basement. You and I can take away a profound lesson from this darkness. The true value of love is never proven when the waters are calm. It is only verified in the terrifying moment you have absolutely everything to lose. A flickering bulb illuminates 4 enforcers circling her in the cellar. The rival boss casually cleans his nails with a hunting knife, demanding the coordinates to the missing millions. Elena shakes violently, sobbing that she knows nothing. His dead eyes reflect a terrifying, clinical void of empathy. With a sudden flash of silver, he drags the blade down her cheek. An agonizing scream tears from her throat. He leans in close, whispering that the next cut goes straight to the bone. The takeaway here is a bitter pill to swallow. Never ignore the toxic red flags of the people you invite into your orbit. Sooner or later, you will be forced to pay their karmic debts with your own blood. She swears she is telling the truth, but the men simply smile. Let us watch this sequence unfold together. The enforcer's fist connects, sending Elena crashing to the concrete. He laughs, raising the blade for a final strike. Elena squeezes her eyes shut, clinging to the psychological anchor of Lucian's promise. Suddenly, the heavy iron door blows off its hinges. Lucian strides through the smoke, drenched in crimson, weapons steady. His unnervingly calm voice drops the room temperature to freezing. Before the men can twitch, he executes them with the calculated grace of an apex predator. 2 enforcers hit the floor dead. He ends the third with a stolen knife, his chest heaving with violent devotion. Here is a brutal truth about survival. Sometimes, when backed into an inescapable corner, the universe sends a monster exactly when you need one. The final hitman makes a fatal cognitive error, using Elena as a human shield. Lucian clears the distance, wrenching the man's arm until the bone shatters. The assassin wails as Lucian presses the hot barrel between his eyes, demanding one reason not to shoot. Then, Elena's fractured voice cuts through his blinding psychological rage. She begs him to drop the weapon, warning that executing this broken man proves the world right about his psychopathy. He may be a monster, but he is hers, and she is pleading for his humanity. In a stunning display of behavioral restraint, the crime lord exhales and slowly lowers his weapon. Listen closely to this final thought. True power is never demonstrated by pulling the trigger. Absolute power is the quiet discipline to know exactly when to hold your fire. Let us open the file on our subject, the enforcer known as Lucian. He pins a survivor against a blood-stained wall, promising absolute destruction to anyone who threatens Elena. Yet, once the threat flees, his psychological armor completely fractures. He drops to his knees, his hands shaking as he cuts her free, drowning in suffocating guilt. Elena, displaying early markers of a profound traumatic bond, reaches out to steady his knuckles. She murmurs that his mercy is his true strength. You and I have reviewed countless case studies of broken minds, and the clinical takeaway here is absolute. A deeply anchored psychological attachment is often the exact force necessary to stabilize a subject, During a catastrophic emotional collapse, the transit to the clinic occurs in total clinical silence. Lucian grips her hand, terrified his psychological anchor might vanish. Beneath harsh lights, a surgeon applies 12 agonizing stitches to her cheek, a permanent physical marker of underworld trauma. Observing her reflection, we document a profound cognitive shift. The terrified civilian has vanished. She stared directly into an abyss of violence and emerged fully acclimatized to her dark reality. When Lucian enters, burdened by the guilt of her injuries, she commands him to bury his regret with absolute resolve. We must recognize a vital truth in behavioral science. Enduring a maximum stress event is often the precise catalyst required to force a fractured subject into claiming total control over their own destiny. The atmosphere in the bedroom registers with oppressive weight. Elena traces dried blood across the enforcer's forehead, attempting to internalize the blame for this trauma. Lucian intercepts her gaze, his voice fracturing under the strain of a pathological devotion. He confesses a willingness to incinerate the entire world, simply to guarantee her safety. This admission of beautifully broken loyalty systematically dismantles her defensive barriers. Elena pulls his shattered psyche back from the edge, admitting she experienced the exact same violent impulse when his survival was threatened. The clinical diagnosis leaves us with a stark truth. Subjects who present as dangerous, unforgiving ruins are often the only individuals truly willing to wage a relentless war on your behalf. That confession lingers before Lucian kisses her with the desperate hunger of a condemned subject. We observe Elena fully awakening to the dark pathology of her mind. She is inextricably bound to this lethal enforcer, a man who pulled her into a violent underworld, yet remains the only human she genuinely trusts. They stumble toward the bed, clothes still contaminated by the night's brutality. Beyond the frosted glass, distant sirens slice through the freezing city air. A rival syndicate is actively hunting them, but her fear response is completely neutralized. Let us examine this clinical phenomenon together. When the external environment is actively trying to destroy you, securing one wonderfully flawed partner to anchor your reality in the wreckage means absolutely everything. The fallout thrusts them into acute psychological decay. For 3 agonizing weeks, they operate as hunted targets, rotating through freezing safe houses, while Lucian's men are eliminated. Elena struggles to maintain cognitive stability, her nervous system misfiring with terror at the sound of a closing door. Beside her, Lucian deteriorates into a remorseless phantom. Sustained entirely by adrenaline, he orchestrates bloody executions from the shadows, bypassing sleep entirely. He exhibits a corrosive obsession, deploying extreme violence to ensure her safety. The clinical pathology painting this scene is painfully clear. A relentless thirst for vengeance does not simply punish a rival faction. It quietly consumes whatever fragile humanity remains within the host. On the 19th morning, the penthouse silence shatters. Lucian drops a dossier onto the glass table, his sunken eyes radiating a calculated intent to kill. He has located Marco, the megalomaniac narcissist who orchestrated Elena's abduction. The target occupies a fortified compound guarded by a militia. Lucian has abandoned all risk assessment. He has finished watching his partner flinch at shadows, swearing this trauma loop ends tonight. Then, he executes an unexpected behavioral pivot. He restores her psychological agency. She can remain locked inside this gilded cage, or step into the violent storm beside him. It highlights a vital clinical truth. True loyalty requires handing someone the terrifying reality and allowing them to consciously dictate their own fate. He studies her exhausted expression, his tone fracturing under the weight of separation anxiety. He admits that leaving her behind guarantees she will spend every second anticipating his death. In that fragile breath, the trauma from the basement resurfaces. Yet, instead of dissociating, Elena demonstrates profound post-traumatic growth. She makes unwavering eye contact and declares her active participation. If they march into the abyss, they do so as a single unit. The ruthless enforcer is psychologically dismantled. He pulls her tightly against his chest, vocalizing a deep-seated belief that he could never deserve a devotion like hers. The clinical lesson here is deeply moving. True emotional integration means you never allow a bonded partner to face a deadly environment alone. Marco's concrete fortress is a direct architectural manifestation of his megalomaniac paranoia. Lucian's infiltration is clinically aggressive. He deploys 12 elite operators, merciless assets conditioned to violently erase threats. Integrated among these killers is Elena. She bears the heavy weight of a Kevlar vest, gripping a firearm Lucian conditioned her to operate. His final behavioral directive was absolute. If a threat enters her proximity, execute without hesitation. Now, she crouches behind an armored sedan in the freezing night, monitoring radio frequencies, as Lucian coordinates an explosive breach. The psychological lesson is written in pure survival metrics. Tactical preparation is vital, because walking blindly into a hostile environment is simply engineering your own termination. The tension registers at a suffocating baseline. Lucian checks his watch, his gaze reflecting a severe collision between pathological attachment and an activated killer instinct. He issues a fail-safe protocol. If his unit fails to extract in 30 minutes, she must use the burner device and permanently erase her identity. He kisses her before dissolving into the woods. Suddenly, the quiet shatters. A massive blast paints the night sky a violent orange. Deafening gunfire tears through the trees, layered with the frantic vocalizations of Marco's dying men. Concealed in the cold, Elena tightly covers her ears, aggressively repressing a suffocating panic attack. It presents a cruel neurological reality we must all face. Often, the most agonizing cognitive battle is enduring the sheer helpless terror of waiting in the dark. As Elena's nervous system threatens to redline, a heavy impact strikes the glass. She raises her weapon, prepared for lethal force, but aborts upon identifying Dante, Lucian S. bleeding lieutenant. He delivers a catastrophic tactical update. Marco is deploying psychological warfare, demanding Elena enter the compound unarmed. His manipulative leverage is extreme. Lucian S. unit is pinned by sniper fire, and Marco has introduced a secondary hostage. It is Grayson, her highly toxic former partner. Marco is offering a sadistic biological exchange her life for his. You and I understand that karma is simply the recurrence of unresolved behavioral loops. This is a brutal clinical lesson. Your unaddressed history will inevitably manifest to violently disrupt your present, usually when you are at your most vulnerable. Dante vocalizes the agonizing variables. Lucian is trapped, bleeding in the mud to ensure his unit's survival. If another man dies tonight, survivor's guilt will permanently shatter his psyche. We observe a profound cognitive shift in Elena's response as she surveys the war zone. Her flight reflex is completely deactivated. She establishes dominant eye contact with Dante, commanding him to escort her inside. The heavy doors breach into Marco's lavish, deceptively tranquil office. In the center sits Grayson, exhibiting severe blunt trauma and restrained to a steel chair. Behind him, Marco smokes a cigar, exuding pathological arrogance. The behavioral takeaway is clear. Sometimes, to neutralize a deep psychological terror, a subject must willfully walk straight into the absolute center of the active pathology. We analyze Marco, the megalomaniac architect of this trauma. He exhales smoke, delivering a twisted psychological revelation. Elena's enforcer did not initiate this conflict. The catastrophic loss of life tonight is entirely the fault of her ex-partner, Grayson, who embezzled $20 million from Marco's syndicate. Grayson exhibits extreme physiological distress, weeping as he blames a market fluctuation. Marco silences him with a sociopathic laugh. The fool gambled syndicate capital on cryptocurrency, concealing his failure with falsified ledgers. Elena stands paralyzed, the weight of his deceit actively rewriting her entire trauma narrative. We must conclude with this stark reality. Never introduce falsified variables to a violent sociopath, because the behavioral mathematics will always balance out in blood. Marco C's refusal to retreat is the classic manifestation of a megalomaniac narcissist. He stands there, his smile devoid of empathy, observing the trembling Grayson like a broken tool. When his predatory gaze locks onto Elena, the psychological atmosphere turns suffocating. He presents a clinical ultimatum: force Lucian to submit or face a citywide massacre. Elena shifts her focus to her former abuser, the very man who systematically dismantled her self-worth. Now his survival hinges entirely on her restraint. You and I can observe the magnificent irony of this power inversion. It offers a profound diagnostic truth. If you shatter another human being, do not be surprised when those broken pieces become the only things left to save your own life. Grayson collapses, exhibiting a total disintegration of his ego. He confesses his monstrous secrets, driven by a primal instinct for self-preservation. In the clinical silence that follows, the power dynamic pivots violently. Rather than succumb to the paralysis of her past trauma, Elena seizes control. Her gaze anchors onto Marco with cold precision. Grayson will transfer the stolen $20 million. In return, she dictates absolute peace. Marco releases a dismissive laugh at this audacity, but Elena maintains unbroken eye contact, coolly stating it is his only option before Lucian dismantles his empire. Recognizing your inherent value and weaponizing it against a predator is the ultimate psychological defense mechanism any of us can master. I find a distinct clinical fascination with a subject who refuses to shatter under extreme duress. Elena stares down this sociopathic kingpin, her neurological responses completely regulated. She delivers a calculated promise. Lucian will systematically bankrupt his operations, forcing Marco to watch his megalomaniac delusions burn. Marco sits rigid in the heavy shadows, assessing her behavioral baseline. A low, genuine laugh finally breaks from his chest. He openly acknowledges her psychological resilience, finally understanding why a pathologically violent man became so utterly fixated on her. He retrieves a silver laptop from a concealed safe and capitulates. When cornered in the darkest spaces of life, projecting quiet, unshakable confidence is the only defense that truly neutralizes a dangerous tyrant. The atmospheric tension shatters when Marco slams the device onto the desk. He severs Grayson's bindings, delivering a promise of future violence. We are witnessing the grotesque, physiological manifestation of cowardice. Grayson is drenched in sweat, his extremities convulsing over the keyboard. For 20 minutes, Elena clinically observes the man who once engineered her suffering reduce himself to pathetic compliance. Marco stands in the periphery, his enforcers confirming the massive transfer via the cold glow of their cellular screens. After a tense silence, Marco issues a calculating nod. He barks rapid Italian commands. Aborting the gang war. Betrayal is a chronic behavioral loop. But if you corner a terrified coward with enough pressure, they will inevitably abandon their loyalty just to survive the night. Marco issues his parting threat, viewing mercy merely as a transactional debt. Elena hauls her former abuser into the freezing night, only to halt. Lucian materializes from the dense fog, presenting as an unhinged apex predator. His clothing is shredded, his breathing erratic from raw adrenaline. He screams, demanding to know why she abandoned their secure location. Elena perfectly regulates her emotional response. She clinically states that she just dismantled the war and spared Grayson. Lucian suffers a cognitive misfire, unable to process why she would preserve her abuser's life. She looks at her fractured partner, her tone absolute. She consciously chose to be merciful, possessing the capacity to destroy an enemy, yet actively choosing restraint, remains the ultimate indicator of a highly evolved human mind. Elena maintains her boundary, extending grace to a man who statistically belonged in a morgue. Let us unpack this dynamic together. Lucian stares, his hardwired neurological impulses for violence colliding with profound relief. He issues Grayson a 10-second window to escape, and the terrified subject vanishes. Lucian pulls Elena against his chest, his voice fracturing as he scolds her for risking her life. Elena instantly deconstructs his obsessive need to control her environment. She establishes them as psychological equals. The phase where she cowers while he bleeds is permanently terminated. The violent kingpin visibly decompensates into something entirely vulnerable. His blood-stained hands frame her jaw, confessing an agonizing terror of losing her. True devotion means stepping out of the passive role and walking firmly into the chaos alongside your partner. She articulates a vow to remain his permanent psychological anchor. Lucian grips her as if she were the sole biological mechanism keeping his heart functional. Still, the collateral damage is irreversible. 3 fatalities, 7 injuries. It is a severe cognitive weight Elena will process indefinitely. Yet, trauma often serves as the catalyst for radical reinvention. 6 months later, the environment shifts to a warm Manhattan bookstore. Elena stands with elevated posture, holding her published manuscript. Her dedication credits Lucian for demonstrating that authentic attachment means accepting a partner's darkest flaws. Standing adjacent to her, visibly dysregulated by the flashing cameras but clad in a formal tuxedo, is the former architect of the underworld. We willingly subject ourselves to intense discomfort just to watch the people we cherish finally step into the light. Lucian's aversion to the media environment is clinically obvious, yet his physical proximity to her remains absolute. He quietly probes her emotional state regarding her realized ambition. Elena exhibits residual anxiety, fearing observers will accuse her of romanticizing a toxic dynamic. Lucian immediately dismantles that cognitive distortion, reinforcing that she merely documented the severe reality of surviving trauma. What the public fails to analyze is that within 6 months, this apex predator entirely dismantled his crime syndicate. He traded his violent hegemony for legitimate real estate, neutralizing any future threat to her safety. He even funded a rehabilitation center for marginalized women. This behavioral shift is a fascinating data point. It proves conclusively that it is never too late to reconstruct a meaningful, healthy existence. From the violent wreckage of your past, that organization operates as Lucian's primary mechanism for psychological atonement. Amidst the positive reinforcement of the event, Elena visually identifies a ghost from her clinical history. Grayson. His physical presentation is alarming. He is reduced to a hollow shell following his fraud convictions. Across the dense crowd, their gazes lock in a final, wordless exchange of power. Grayson slowly elevates a copy of her manuscript in a defeated salute, before retreating into the rain. Lucian, hypervigilant to any anomaly, registers the microscopic shift in her baseline state. His protective instincts surge as he quietly investigates her emotional stability. Elena provides a stabilized, authentic smile, confirming she is completely unbothered. For the first time, her neurological response genuinely aligns with her words. The most profound stage of trauma recovery is simply dropping the heavy chains of your past and walking steadily forward. The promotional event subjects her to 3 exhausting hours of interrogation. Elena navigates the journalists, guarding the supreme irony that the violent antagonist of her narrative is standing mere feet away, exhibiting complete apathy while scrolling on his phone. Upon the evening's conclusion, Lucian transports her home. Observe this critical transition in their environmental conditioning. They do not retreat to a highly fortified penthouse. Instead, they park outside an ordinary brownstone in a subdued Brooklyn district. They systematically eradicated their chaotic defense mechanisms just to construct this profoundly mundane reality. Elena discards her footwear, collapsing onto the couch with genuine fatigue, playfully requesting he cancel all future tours. You and I must recognize the therapeutic value of this quiet resolution. Securing a stable, unremarkable sanctuary with your partner is the only psychological victory that truly matters. Lucian references her impending promotional schedule, triggering a groan of exhaustion from Elena. He produces a rare chuckle, his heavily scarred hands gently massaging her fatigued feet. He validates her success, noting that the public responded to her unshielded psychological vulnerability. She never masked that forming an attachment to a dangerous man demands severe cognitive endurance. Elena quietly observes him, this former architect of extreme violence, a subject who burned criminal empires to ensure her safety, now functions as her calm emotional regulator. Staring into his dark eyes, she softly discloses her pregnancy. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifts instantly. He freezes, his micro-expressions transitioning from ingrained trauma responses to profound, unfiltered elation. Healing truly begins the exact second we lower our pathological defenses and fully embrace the reality of a positive future. Visualize this fascinating clinical outcome. The violent phantom of the underground is completely emotionally dysregulated. Elena produces 3 positive medical tests, her voice trembling as she compulsively analyzes his history and its implications for a child. Lucian interrupts this cognitive spiral with a grounding kiss. This once terrifying threat, a man who conditioned thousands into submission, now exhibits genuine tears, whispering that it is flawless. This highlights a fundamental psychological absolute. No behavioral history is pristine, but when a new life is yours, protective instincts will forcefully overwrite past damage. The case file advances 2 years. Elena sits in her study, outlining her next text. Resting beside her is little Isabella, presenting with her father's dark features, her mother's analytical eyes, and an entirely uncorrupted baseline of fierce independence. Let us open this case file together, you and I, to examine an anomaly rarely seen in apex predators. We observe a man whose syndicate relies on absolute violence, now dismantled by the rhythmic breathing of his newborn infant. The kingpin dissolves into the dark, humming a lullaby, yet his neurological hypervigilance remains active. Paranoia has turned their home into an armed fortress. Elena observes this, recognizing a terrifying truth about human attachment. Connection removes a sociopath's armor, exposing the jugular, while providing a monstrous adrenaline to protect the unit. The psychological takeaway is undeniable. Our greatest legacies are never the violent empires we construct, but the fragile lives we actively choose to shield from our own darkness. We observe Elena cradling her infant, staring into the neon bleed of the city. My analysis of her early history reveals a victim conditioned by abusers to believe she held zero value. That fragile iteration is completely overwritten. The human psyche can endure absolute trauma, map out a network of scars, and still successfully recalibrate. She operates as a sovereign entity now, having pacified the violent sociopath who just walked in. Lucian enters, radiating the cold exhaustion of syndicate warfare. Yet, upon visual contact with his family, his autonomic nervous system regulates instantly, the winter in his stare melting. The clinical reality is simple. True psychological safety is not finding a world without threats, but securing the individual who completely neutralizes your internal chaos. Notice the chilling cognitive dissonance unfolding here. Lucian kisses his partner's temple, shifting from a bonded caregiver into the architect of a cartel power vacuum without elevating his heart rate. His primary rival has just been eliminated. We see psychopathic calculation moving behind his eyes. He states calmly that the rival territory will run red, yet their perimeter is secure. He purchased the loyalty of the opposing inner circle years in advance, placing a puppet on a throne he engineered. Elena absorbs this reality without a flinch, indicating deep psychological desensitization to extreme violence. It highlights a brutal evolutionary truth. If your brain is not calculating 5 steps ahead of the apex predators in the dark, you have already become their next target. Examine Elena's steady gaze here. She possesses a clinical understanding of the predator she married. She observes a man who neutralizes targets with terrifying detachment, yet her brain floods with gratitude for the violent perimeter he maintains. A sharp wail echoes from the nursery. In a fascinating display of behavioral contrast, this megalomaniacal enforcer sprints down the hall to attend to an infant. Later, Elena finds him on the balcony, his neurological defense mechanisms lowering. He whispers a confession that splinters his facade, admitting he never anticipated surviving long enough to experience true silence. It exposes a psychological paradox. Often, the most dangerous individuals on this planet wage pathological war simply to secure a peaceful patch of ground to call their own. Focus on the micro-expressions crossing Lucius' face. Historically, his dopamine receptors were addicted to the adrenaline of destruction, thriving on the cold calculus of dismantling syndicates. Tonight, this architect of ruin is neurologically disarmed by his family. Elena traces his jawline, operating under no delusions. She knows she is bonded to a psychopath, yet exhibits an attachment that defies survival logic. The case file flashes back to their traumatic genesis. A stranded vehicle, the impulsive decision to enter a dangerous stranger's sedan. It forces us to confront a terrifying variable in behavioral development. One single choice, made during an acute stress response in a storm, holds the power to rewire your entire destiny, delivering either total salvation or utter devastation. Consider the alternate psychological reality of our subject. Had she avoided that initial traumatic stimulus, she would still be trapped in an isolated, depressive existence. Instead, she actively immersed herself in chaos. We observe her now under stage lights, presenting as a celebrated author. She displays a jagged scar as a trophy of survival, a physical manifestation of bonding with a man who would incinerate the city for her. The civilian crowd projects romantic fantasies, misdiagnosing her husband as a rehabilitated sociopath. But the clinical truth is that violent tendencies are never truly eradicated. It drives home a profound conclusion. True mental fortitude is never about avoiding trauma. It is about gathering your shattered cognitive pieces and forging an absolute weapon. Let us systematically strip away the masking of this event. Lucian remains an active threat, funding mercenaries while laundering his conscience through donations. He is a textbook case of compartmentalization. Sitting in the front row, he radiates the coiled cortisol of a predator in confinement. On his knee sits their daughter, mirroring his calculating stare. Elena observes her dangerous family unit and experiences a rush of pride, completely devoid of ethical constraints. She delivers a speech that surgically dissects the audience's hypocrisy, demanding they stop suppressing their traumas. It serves as a vital behavioral reminder. True psychological dominance does not stem from a flawless public illusion. It rises from weaponizing the raw, unapologetic truth of your own pathology. Stick with me here, as we witness a critical fracture in the subject's emotional armor. The megalomaniac experiences an involuntary lacrimal response. It is a microscopic failure of his suppression mechanisms, which Elena logs. We shift to a restaurant where the psychological dynamic severely pivots. Their daughter manipulates the room with advanced cognitive processing, developing into a terrifying force. Lucian agrees, but suddenly his autonomic nervous system spikes. He leans across the table, vocal cords tightening. The apex predator confesses he is paralyzed by intrusive thoughts, terrified his violent history will eventually breach their perimeter. It confirms a strict clinical rule. You can synthesize a functioning future, but your dark past will always collect its psychological debt. Notice this claustrophobic observation. Lucian exhibits a severe guilt complex, catastrophizing that his pathology will infect his offspring. Elena initiates a grounding technique, using eye contact to interrupt his cognitive spiral and cement their trauma bond. The tension snaps when their daughter demands dinner. We observe a rapid state transition. The cartel leader shifts into tactical mode, analyzing pasta, using the neurological pathways he uses to orchestrate a raid. Elena processes this bizarre regulatory behavior, accepting her assimilation into his environment. Later, Lucian observes her with profound idealization, mesmerized that she transmuted extreme violence into stable domesticity. True loyalty is the resilience to construct reality in the absolute worst conditions. The auditory isolation here is absolute. Elena initiates a confrontation with the primary stressor, who both ruined and rescued her. She demands transparency. Does he feel remorse for weaponizing her vulnerabilities? The megalomaniac hesitates, issuing a fragmented apology, but watch his body language as he closes the proximity. He exhibits sociopathic possessiveness, swearing he feels zero remorse for orchestrating mass destruction to acquire her. Instead of a flight response, Elena leans into the hands responsible for ending lives. She took a union built on pathological deception and rewired it into a secure attachment. The diagnostic takeaway is clear. You cannot control your initial conditioning, but you possess the authority to dictate your own recovery. The session transitions to a starkly lit dining room. Elena sits across from their teenage daughter, Bella. Refusing to employ sanitized narratives, Elena subjects her daughter to the unfiltered empirical data of their history. She clinically dissects the blown tire, the predator in the shadows, and the cognitive dissonance required to bond with a man who generated massive collateral damage. Bella processes this without flinching, synthesizing her mother's detachment with her father's calculating pathology. It forces you and I to confront an uncomfortable truth to close this file. A functional family unit is rarely a sterile construct. It is the aggressive behavioral commitment to stand by your chosen pod, even when your environment is actively combusting. We observe a classic manifestation of trauma rationalization here. Bella asks the clinical question, was the psychological destruction truly worth it? Elena exhibits zero hesitation. To a mind warped by severe Stockholm Syndrome, the abuse must hold profound value, or the psyche shatters entirely. She insists the night terrors were a fair price for her daughter. Then the maternal instinct breaks through. She warns Bella that she never has to bleed to earn affection, or build a life on broken glass. Bella promises to avoid the fire, but Elena understands behavioral loops. She remembers her own delusional youth, certain she could tame a monster and emerge untouched. Here is a simple, enduring truth about human nature. You can scream the clearest warnings, but people must ultimately survive the fires they ignite themselves. Let us examine this clinical picture together. You cannot construct a psychological barrier strong enough to shield your loved ones from severe trauma. You can only ground them when the madness strikes. Lucien formed his attachment exactly this way, highly pathological, yet deeply real to them both. Picture a freezing, rain-swept night. Elena stands by the towering glass of their brownstone. Her mind regresses to that desolate parking lot where a megalomaniac shattered her reality. She did not simply cope. She eradicated her former self and emerged as a hardened survivor. Then the kingpin steps from the shadows, embracing his creation. The lesson here is strikingly practical. Your absolute lowest, most terrifying psychological break can serve as the exact soil where your greatest reinvention takes root. You simply have to claim it. His voice breaks the silence, probing her internal state. Elena leans into him, murmuring that she feels lucky. Notice the dark irony of that cognitive dissonance. Lucien laughs, acknowledging he pulled her into a violent nightmare. Even a megalomaniac occasionally recognizes his role as the villain. But Elena turns, locking eyes with the man who systematically dismantled and rebuilt her reality, anchored by their shared empire. She vows she would never reverse a single second of her conditioning. His sociopathic edge softens as he whispers that he is the fortunate one. She smiles, fully assimilated. The simple life lesson here is profound. Genuine gratitude never requires a pristine past. It is about looking at the chaotic wreckage you survived and realizing it became the absolute foundation of your current strength. The frightened victim she once was is just a psychological ghost. She learned the harshest clinical truth. You cannot control the violence that targets you, but you dictate the personality that solidifies in the aftermath. She held eye contact with a dangerous predator, found the humanity beneath his pathology, and secured her survival. Today, she actively extracts other victims from the shadows. She loves him because human bonding is profoundly flawed. It means observing a partner with all their dark, antisocial tendencies, yet choosing to anchor yourself to them anyway. As thunder rolls over the city, they remain locked together. Keep this simple lesson in mind. True resilience is never about avoiding the pain of your trauma. It is taking the shattered fragments of your psyche and forging them into an impenetrable fortress. Let us close this case file and conclude our analysis. Somewhere tonight, in a desolate parking lot, another vulnerable person is stranded. Elena genuinely hopes a benign citizen stops. But clinically speaking, she prays that if a manipulative sociopath with a predatory smile approaches, the victim has the biological impulse to flee. Not every mind possesses the resilience to endure profound trauma bonding and emerge intact. Elena is a statistical anomaly of extreme survival bias. She adapted to the darkness and became the architect of her own reality. Here is your final practical life lesson. Always trust that sudden, quiet alarm in your gut. Life may present a chaotic second chance, but you must cultivate the wisdom to know exactly when to sprint for the exit. and when to plant your feet firmly and construct your empire.
The deepest lesson in Elena and Lucien's story is that love cannot become healthy unless it moves beyond possession, secrecy, and survival. Lucien repeatedly says Elena is his, protects what is his, and believes that his power gives him the right to decide what is best for her. At first, this feels seductive because Elena has been lonely, poor, and emotionally broken by Grayson. Lucien's attention makes her feel seen. But the story becomes educational when Elena discovers the truth and refuses to accept love that was built from a psychological playbook. Her anger is an act of self-respect. She demands her own room, access to Lucien's financials, the names of those who investigated her, and space from him unless she chooses otherwise. This is a powerful moment because Elena stops being only the rescued woman and becomes someone setting terms for her own survival. Lucien's forced decision to give her access to his empire is also significant. It is not enough to say, "I love you." He must risk transparency. He must give her enough truth to decide whether staying is truly her choice. This teaches viewers that love is not proven by expensive gifts, protection, revenge, or obsession. Love is proven by accountability, honesty, respect for boundaries. A relationship that begins with manipulation can only become meaningful if the person who caused harm fully admits it and changes behavior. Elena's love for Lucien may be real, but it cannot be allowed to erase what he did. The educational message is mature. Love should not be a cage decorated as safety. Real love gives someone the power to stay freely, not because they're trapped, afraid, or dependent, but because truth has finally made choice possible.